Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. Thanks for joining us this fine Saturday. And by the way, you are the real heroes. Instead of enjoying probably the last relatively warm day outside, you decided to spend the next hour in front of the screen. That's what I call a commitment. Good for you. Today, we will discuss one of the most depressing issues of our lifetime, climate change, and how to avert a climate catastrophe. As a science journalist, I write a lot about climate change, and I see how the perception of it shifts over time. Just a couple of years ago, you could find comments like, "This is not real," and "Don't lie to us," under any climate-related news article. These days, such behavior is becoming more and more rare. People see wildfires, they see melting permafrost, extreme weather events, and rising sea levels, and they are beginning to understand that climate change is indeed real and it concerns everyone. Today, we will look at this problem from an unusual perspective. We will discuss not the physics of climate change, but its psychology. We will talk about what stops us from taking action. Some technical details. We will have a lecture for about 40 minutes, and then there will be time for your questions. Please submit them in the chat window or comment section. Let me introduce our wonderful speaker, Professor Jeffrey Beatty, who's an academic psychologist, writer, and a broadcaster. He's a professor of psychology at Edge Hill University. In 2015, he presented his research on why we need to target implicit automatic associations in the fight against climate change at the United Nations Conference. Professor Beatty has published more than 20 books that have been translated into several languages. Hopefully, after today's lecture, his works will be translated into Russian as well. He's a fellow of the British Psychological Society and was awarded the Spearman Medal for published psychological research of outstanding merit. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, yes.
How are you there?
Very well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Last time I saw you, it was exactly 1 year ago at the Museum of London. Did anything change in your life since then?
Yeah, I've written some more books since then. I've written a book on related to sustainability on trophy hunting. And I've just written a memoir about social class and education in the UK.
Oh, wow, sounds interesting. And how's your lockdown going?
Very good for writing. There's not much else to do. So it's been very good time to study. So I'm back at the university now. We're teaching on campus some of the time. So
I think it's good for students to see their professors in real life and not only on screen.
Exactly, yeah.
I think it's time to switch to your lecture. Please, the floor is yours. We are listening to you.
Okay, right. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you so much for attending. And if the weather is nice outside, it's lovely that you've come inside. The title of my talk is "How to Avoid a Climate Catastrophe," which is, as has already been said, climate change is a very pessimistic, depressing topic, but I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of it. First slide, please. Okay, so how are we going to avoid a climate catastrophe? Well, we need a green revolution. And I think revolution here is the right word. We need a global change. And a change at so many levels, a change in political focus, in terms of, political forces getting together to argue for this. We need a change in infrastructure. It's all very well talking about people changing their modes of transport, but if those public modes of transport aren't available, there's an issue. But the really, really big issue, which is often neglected, is I think we need a change in people's behavior, their choices and their priorities. I think people are the key to this, because without people, none of these other things will happen. And we need changes in people at the national level, in terms of cities and towns, in terms of communities and groups, in terms of families, and in terms of individuals. It's about individual change a lot of the time. And people getting the message and getting on board and arguing for this. And I think, therefore, psychology is central to the whole argument. So much of the debate about climate change is about the physics of climate change or the geophysics. But I think psychology is absolutely central to what needs to be done. Now, I'm going to say that there's argument, we need to consider this at a number of different levels. I think it seems to me, and it seems to everyone else, that the message about climate change hasn't really got through, in the sense that people's behavior changes, their apparent priorities, hasn't really matched the seriousness of the issue. And the question is, why is that? Now, there's a number of specific topics I'd like to talk about. I think, first of all, there is the issue about people's understanding of climate change. I think there's a real issue there. I think it's about people's belief systems and their belief in climate change, and there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. A big issue is people's sense of personal vulnerability, and I'll talk about that. Then there's this sense of personal responsibility and whether they feel they should do something and they could do something. And then lastly, I want to talk about behavior and action, because I think what we've noticed about climate change is people's behavior doesn't match the rhetoric some of the time, and we need to address that issue directly. And I've got some specific things I want to say about that. Now, of course, Greta Thunberg has got us all talking about climate change, talking much more than we did before. I like the heading here, which is Game Changer of the Year, and her saying, "Can you hear me?" Well, people can hear her, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things change immediately. So I think there are all kinds of issues there, and I think this is where the psychology comes in. Now, in understanding, first of all, I think the first thing to say about climate change is there is a good deal of confusion about what it actually is, because climate change, in some senses, is quite abstract, because it's about looking at long-term changes with enormous and tangible effects on all our lives, effects which are happening now, effects that will be happening in the future, but it's a longer term perspective on things. And I think there is a problem, first of all, that people confuse sometimes weather and local weather and climate. And what's really interesting from a psychology point of view, they will use examples of weather as evidence against climate change. So if it gets cold, they will say, well, that's the argument against climate change out the window, because it's really, really cold today. And I've got a little example of that. I was on a bus in Sheffield, which is in the north of England, a little while ago. And I was just traveling along. I had a notebook sitting on my lap with the words "climate change!" exclamation mark on the book. And a gentleman sat next to me and kind of noticed, he was kind of glancing around, noticed the words "climate change" in my notebook. And he said to me, "You don't believe in that rubbish, do you?" And he kind of pointed to outside the window, and it was a very, very fine dusting of snow. And it's like, how could you possibly believe in climate change when there's a tiny, tiny bit of snow in Sheffield? And he was kind of looking around the bus to get people to agree with him. There was some person here that believes in something which is so ridiculous, given the evidence of our own eyes. And I think there is this tendency to always believe the evidence of our own eyes and kind of cling to those things that we think give us are positive and give us hope, like a little bit of snow at this particular time of the year. And of course, I didn't want to argue with them, because it's often been pointed out that climate change is like politics and death. You don't really talk about it in polite conversation. And you don't talk about it because, of course, what's really interesting is that people have such different views about it, and such different views which are very, very strongly held. So you don't want to get into an argument about it, which is interesting. But what was interesting from my point of view was this notion of understanding what would count as evidence against climate change, and a momentary change in the weather doesn't count as evidence against it. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump, in the media quite a lot at the moment because of the presidential election. But, again, someone who's branded climate change as fake news, a hoax. And again, he's someone who clings on to this notion that once the weather gets slightly colder, that refutes climate change. So in December 2017, he tweeted, "It could be the coldest New Year's Eve on record. Perhaps we could use a bit of that good old global warming." So as soon as there was a momentary change in the weather, his understanding was that was the evidence, all the evidence he needed against climate change. So it's not quite like that. So I think people need to understand a little bit more about what counts as evidence for and against climate change and to get the bigger picture. Okay. And then, of course, there's belief systems, because some people strongly believe in climate change and some people don't seem to believe in it. And what's really interesting is that the proportion of people who believe in it does change systematically depending upon a whole series of things. So that in one survey done in the US a couple of years ago now, found that just over half the people there believed that global warming was happening. And that figure fluctuates with economic conditions and other factors. And 50% of those people thought that global warming, if it does exist, was attributable to natural causes. So the science about climate change didn't seem to be getting through. And there was a kind of marked difference in belief between different people. Okay, so what differentiates believers and non-believers? Because from a psychology point of view, it's always interesting why some people hold strong beliefs in one thing, some people hold strong beliefs in something different. Now, the first thing I think is just connection with science, people's faith in science, their willingness to accept what scientists say, and their understanding of science. So I think that's a kind of critical difference between individuals. And I think there is something about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, when they do their kind of status reports every few years. Of course, what marks their reports and science generally is that it's couched in probabilistic terms. So they will say something like, it's 95% certain that human beings are responsible for climate change. But of course, it's not. Critics will say, well, it's not 100% certain. It's not, but as Benjamin Franklin, I think, said, it's only death and taxes that are certain. Everything else is just a probability. And that's how science works. It works in terms of probability. But critics will say, well, it's not 100% certain. So I think there is an issue about people understanding that science makes the best predictions possible, but it's always couched in probabilistic terms. So I think that's one issue that differentiates believers and non-believers, which is faith in and understanding of science. I think the second is what you might call political and ideological position, which it shows a marked difference in people's belief in climate change. In the US, for example, it looks as if only 50% of Republicans, but about 88% of Democrats in one survey done a few years ago, believed in climate change. And what's really interesting is that divergence between Republicans and Democrats only emerged after the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, of course, was coming up with an international limitations on greenhouse gas emissions. But what was really interesting is that, in some sense, the energy companies saw the challenge of the Kyoto Protocol for their business. And in the year after, between 97 and 98, there was a huge a surfeit of publications arguing against the position about climate change. And what was interesting, before 97, Republicans and Democrats, the proportion who believed in climate change was almost identical. But in the light of Kyoto and the enunciation of the implications for the energy sector and the emergence of these publications, these proportions started diverging. So I think that's a really interesting issue, which is if we need a global response and if there are such divergences depending upon political position, how do we get the world all to come together? And that's all to do with information and the processing information. Of course, belief in climate change also seems to vary by education. The higher the level of education, there tends to be more understanding and belief in climate change. Age, a lot of emphasis on younger people being more concerned about it. Social class, higher social classes tend to have more understanding and concern, and the type of media that you consume in terms of what kind of messages are getting through. But as well as all of that, I would also suggest that individual psychology plays a huge role. It's not just those things. There's something about people and how they process information and how they live their lives, which I think has got enormous implications for trying to understand why some people don't believe in it, don't get the messages, and are unlikely to do anything. And I think this kind of individual psychology really needs to be addressed if we're going to have a green revolution, if we're going to avoid a climate catastrophe. And the kinds of things I've got in mind are certain kinds of cognitive biases, certain kinds of unconscious values and attitudes. And I want to say a little bit about each of these. Okay, now the third thing I wanted to talk about, and this links to the point just made about biases, is our sense of personal vulnerability. Now, what's really interesting about climate change is some people do believe that it's going to be really important one day, and it's going to be really important for other countries overseas, but it's not going to concern them. It's not going to affect them and their lives. And to me, again, from a psychology point of view, this is a very interesting issue, which is we think that we're not going to be affected by it. Now, I would argue from a psychology point of view, if that's how you feel, then that's got enormous implications for how you live your life. Now, I've been doing some research with some colleagues, especially someone called Dr. Laura McGuire, over the last few years on this topic. Now, one bias in particular is particularly relevant here, and that's called optimism bias. Now, optimism bias is a really interesting feature of being a human being. Human beings tend to suffer from it at some point in their lives, but the level varies depending upon what kind of person you are, and it varies a little bit from domain to domain. But about 80% of the time, we do display some degree of optimism bias. And optimism bias means that we overestimate the likelihood of positive events happening to us personally and underestimate the likelihood of negative events. We think we're going to be the ones who are okay. Now, the point about optimism bias, as I say, it's very common. So if you ask people whether their marriages will succeed, you can stop them walking up the aisle if you like and ask them, is this marriage going to work? They will say, of course it is. How certain are you that it's going to succeed? 95% certain. You present them with the statistics about divorce rates, and they say that only applies to other people. It doesn't apply to me. People starting a business, you ask them how likely it is to work. They say, very likely. It's a brilliant idea. Show them the businesses and startups that fail. It's of no concern to them. So we can't overestimate the chances that our lives are going to be kind of rosy and good and positive. If you ask smokers whether they think they'll get lung cancer, they way underestimate the probability compared to even when you show them the statistics. Now, what's interesting about this optimism bias is some people are more extreme than others, not surprisingly. And we call those people dispositional optimists. These are people who've got a particular kind of personality profile, and they way overestimate the chances of good things happening in their lives. So when it comes to climate change, it clearly seems to be operating because people, generally speaking, don't think that they're going to be affected compared to other people. They think that it will affect other places, and that's called a spatial bias, and future generations, and that's called a temporal bias, but it won't affect them. And you could argue that a lot of climate change communications aren't helping with this. Every time I see an image of a polar bear stranded on a tiny bit of ice, I think, well, that's just telling people that it's going to affect the climate somewhere else on the globe. And every time I see, and I can see why you would have climate change messages with parents reading stories to their children in order to affect their concept of responsibility. But again, it's kind of implying that it's going to be mainly in the future. Now, in the future, in other places is great in a way, but it's also going to affect people in their own lives. And it's only when you get that concept of personal vulnerability, you get action of a different kind. And I think this whole optimism bias is a kind of defense mechanism. And it's a defense mechanism which, as I'll show now, is affected by biased information processing. So in some sense, it doesn't matter what information you get to people, unless you think very carefully about it. They're processing it in a biased way, which allows them to live in this optimism bubble and think, well, it's not going to affect me in my life. Now, what we know about optimism bias, it's affected by brain activity. Now, there's some really interesting research done at Oxford a few years ago, which measured neural activity in a scanner as people estimated their probability of experiencing various negative events. So you might ask people, what's the chances of you suffering from Alzheimer's later in life? Or what's the chances of you being the victim of a burglary? And then in this, whilst they were in the scanner, they were presented with real information about the relevant statistics. So this is the probability of Alzheimer's. This is the probability of having a burglary. And what they found was that people were more likely to change their estimate. They were then asked again about the probability of this occurring. So they've got the real information. They were more likely to change their estimate only if the new information was better than originally anticipated. So in other words, if it was better than you thought, you changed it, and you upped it. But if it was worse than you thought, you tended not to reduce it. And what was really interesting was that dispositional optimists showed this with a vengeance. They really went for this bias in processing. This bias was actually reflected in their brain activity, their functional magnetic resonance imaging data, the actual scan data. And what the researchers found was that there was a reduced level of neural coding of undesirable information in a critical region of the frontal cortex. A bit of the brain was called the right inferior prefrontal gyrus. In other words, when people got the negative information, their brain was paying less attention to that information. It's almost as if we've got kind of blinkers out there looking for the information we want. If we see something we don't want, we just don't process it in the same way. So this optimism bias, how is it maintained? It's maintained by selective information processing. We did some research on this using eye tracking, and we wanted to do something quite simple, which was we wanted to show people messages about climate change. And then we wanted to look at exactly what they fixated on in these messages. Now, when people look at a message, there are two kinds of aspects of eye behavior that you might be interested in. One's called a fixation, where the eyes are temporarily still to process the information. And then between these fixations, there are things called saccades, or saccadic eye movements, which is the changes in the movement in which not much information is processed. So we were really interested in the gaze fixations of people that read climate change messages. So they read articles online with arguments for climate change, and the arguments for climate change are the bad news, which is the evidence is conclusive that things are changing. It's pretty bad. The climate is getting worse. It's got enormous implications. This is not emotionally positive. And then against climate change, and the against climate change is saying, well, the science might not be 100%. There may be problems with it. There's some disputes about it. Some people don't agree with it. And in some sense, emotionally, that's good news. That's saying, well, hang on, there's a bit of a dispute going on here. And what we did was these things that people read had arguments either for or against in adjacent paragraphs. So they read a whole kind of script about climate change, and there was paragraphs with good news and bad news, and we were interested in where they fixated. And we measured level of dispositional optimism. And we did a kind of analysis of the gaze fixations, and this is a little hotspot analysis of the gaze fixations of optimists and non-optimists, really arguments against climate change, and that's the first paragraph, or for climate change, and that's the second paragraph. Now, there's a couple of interesting things you can see immediately, hopefully, from the hotspot analysis. You can see that the non-optimists have got darker patches on the whole thing generally. So in other words, once they knew they were reading about climate change, they read it more carefully. They had more fixations all over the articles. When optimists read articles about climate change, they had less fixations generally. So in other words, give an optimist, a dispositional optimist, an article about climate change, they kind of read it a bit more superficially. And really interestingly, the dark spots tended to be focused on the arguments against climate change, on the emotionally good bits, the bits saying the science isn't that conclusive, it's not that clear. And the results were pretty conclusive. The optimists spent less time attending to any arguments about climate change. They had significantly shorter fixation durations than non-optimists on the arguments for climate change. And the optimists concentrated more on arguments against climate change. So you present exactly the same material to individuals who vary depending upon level of dispositional optimism. And the way that they fixate on these stories is very different. And very different with some really interesting implications. When we asked them to summarize the article, 2/3 of the non-optimists, when you asked them, what was that article you just read about? They said, 2/3 of the non-optimists said, well, it was an article about climate change and it's about global warming and how 95% of it's due to human activity. They saw the whole thing as being an important article about climate change. That's not what the optimists saw. They said, well, it's really a debate, really. It's people arguing with each other. It's not conclusive. They're still arguing about it. So optimists and non-optimists, when they look at the same material, they notice different things, they fixate on different things, and surprise, surprise, they remember different things from it. So it's one issue about if we're going to persuade people about climate change, we have to bear in mind that there is this thing called optimism bias, and that some people like to use this defense mechanism more than others to keep out the bad news information. And then when we ask them about their personal vulnerability with respect to climate change, what's the probability of you personally being affected by climate change? Optimists said, oh, about 36%, about 1 in 3. Non-optimists said more than half. So non-optimists thought that the balance of probability was they were going to be affected by it. Optimists thought the balance of probability would be that they wouldn't be affected by it. And we did this estimates across a whole range of things, and the optimists and the non-optimists differed significantly on all the measures. So it's as if this defense mechanism, this optimism bias, affects what you see, what you remember, and affects your perceived vulnerability. And this is an issue that I think we need to address if we're going to get people to act together. The implications, by the way, just for messaging about this, messages about climate change may not be getting through because of an inherent cognitive bias designed to sustain our mood state. It's more severe for dispositional optimists. We have to bear that in mind. And I think if we're going to make sure that people understand about climate change, we need a more positive frame about possible solutions, which should increase both feelings of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy simply means that actually I can do something about this, and visual attention to the underlying message. I mean, I think the problem is with messages like Greta Thunberg's been using, our house is on fire. It's just instilling fear without telling people that there are possible solutions if we act in unison, if we act immediately. And I think you have to remind people that there are things we can do, because that lifts their mood and reinforces their belief that they can do something. I think without that, people just have defense mechanisms to guard against climate change. Now, the fourth thing I wanted to talk about is this notion of our sense of personal responsibility. Because to me, this is really interesting, and it's about the sense of personal responsibility of the ordinary citizen, about us in our everyday lives. We've known for quite a while now that human activities are a major driver of the rapid change in our climate, particularly patterns of consumption and energy use driven by consumer demand for higher standards of living. This is an important aspect of climate change, you know. And it's interesting that you could argue that the first kind of attempt at a green revolution happened about 10 years ago, when a whole series of multinationals kind of got the point about consumption and climate change. And I remember hearing the CEO of Unilever saying, you know, there's no, and this was pretty stark, there's no profit in a dead planet. And they thought we have to do something about this. And in 2010, they launched this sustainable living plan. And they said, look, we need to do something about the carbon footprint of our products. We need to get consumers on board. We need to start reducing the carbon footprint across the life cycle. So they reduced the greenhouse gas emissions from their manufacturing chain. They reduced deforestation. They doubled the use of renewable energy. They produced concentrated liquids and powders. They reduced greenhouse gas emissions from transport. They reduced greenhouse gas emissions from refrigerations, reduced employee travel. So they did, as an organization, as a huge multinational company, all the things that they thought they could do in order to try and reduce the carbon footprint to half the impact by 2020. And what happened? The result was they found the greenhouse gas footprint impact per consumer increased by around 5% since 2010. So in other words, it kept going up. They'd done everything in the manufacturing chain to try and reduce it, but incredibly, it was going up. And their conclusion was, we've made good progress in those areas under our control, but the big challenges are those areas not under our direct control, like consumer behavior. In other words, consumers, us as citizens and as consumers, are a big aspect of this whole thing. And it was us who weren't getting the message and taking personal responsibility and doing something. And this left Unilever somewhat puzzled about what to do next. Well, and some people said, well, okay, what we need to do then is to work on self-efficacy and response efficacy. We need to make it easier for consumers. Look, and there was a lot of attitudinal service at the time, certainly in the UK, obviously where I work. And the figures were starkly clear, which was 80% of people wanted to do something about this. So this is in 2010. They really wanted to change their behavior. They got the message. They got the message early about climate change. And this led another multinational called Tesco to say, look, okay, they want to change. This is 2010. We can help them. And Terry Leahy, who was CEO, said, consumers want to do more in the fight against climate change if only we can make it easier and more affordable. And he kept mentioning a whole series of market surveys which seemed to demonstrate that. And what they did was they introduced carbon labeling on their products. And carbon labeling was a very simple technique to inform consumers of the carbon implications of any product. The idea would be you could, when choosing products, you could compare products in terms of their carbon footprint and choose the one with the lower carbon footprint, drive the carbon budget down that way. And of course, then companies would invest more in generating low carbon products. And this is what the carbon footprint looked like on one particular product, which was a low energy light bulb. You can see on the left, the black footprint. It gives you all the information about the carbon footprint. And the idea was, look, once Tesco had done this, they'd say, look, why would you ever buy a higher energy light bulb again? This is all the information consumers want. And this was the start of let's call it the first revolution, the first green revolution, to be led by consumer demand to drive the market. And Tesco were incredibly confident this was going to work because it had worked with health information on food. They had put fat information on food, calorie information on food. And what they found was an immediate effect on people's purchasing habits. People avoided those very high content fat foods almost immediately. And Tesco had a plan to label all 70,000 of its own brand products. And it took several months to calculate the carbon footprint of each individual product. And the calculation was verified by the Carbon Trust by an independent body. And the idea was that consumers should now choose the low carbon alternative. And this was done with incredible optimism, with support from the very highest level in the UK government. But how did consumers actually behave? Didn't work. They didn't behave as they should in terms of actually buying the low carbon products. It just didn't have the immediate effect or even the longer term effect that Tesco had hoped for. In our laboratory, we did some research on this. We thought, well, what's going on here? And what we did was we showed people images of products. And we found something which perhaps Tesco should have checked before they started doing this. They hardly looked at the carbon labels at all. There was a very significant value action gap, even when the course of action is clear. And the value action gap was even in terms of the reported values, which is we really care about carbon footprint, and action here, meaning we don't even look at them when we're showing them. And this just shows the amount of time people spend looking at the carbon footprint information, other features of products. And I've just put up there 3 products. Yellow is the low energy light bulb, orange is orange juice, and blue is the detergent. And you can see there that they do look at the carbon footprint of the low energy light bulb a bit of the time, much more than the other products, because of course they can see that that's in some sense good news. You know, everyone knows that low energy has a lower carbon footprint. The other products, they didn't check it out. And the point was they spent so much time looking at the price, the value, all those other things, rather than the carbon footprint. Now, and a really interesting question then is what determines what people have got in what order. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But the point was carbon labeling didn't work. Tesco stopped it in 2012. And the carbon label didn't even affect people's visual attention to features of a product. So it didn't work at the time. The question is why? Because we can't have a green revolution led by citizens, by consumers, if we don't understand these basic issues. So the big question is, there is this thing called the value action gap. Look, it's kind of incomprehensible because people say in many countries that they care deeply about carbon footprint. The whole discourse about Greta Thunberg is, of course, there's going to be a revolution. Everyone's saying they care deeply. And yet when you test their behavior, even their visual behavior, even what they attend to, even to what they notice, they don't seem to be acting in accordance with what they say. And this value action gap is shown in many aspects of environmental behavior. Now, here's 2 quite horrific slides in a way. These are just 2 pop festivals in the UK involving mainly young people. Young people seem to report the most positive attitudes to environmental issues. And this is a pop festival after the attendees have gone home, this is what they left behind in terms of plastic. Many young people say they are poor, plastic waste, this is what they're leaving behind. And this is a different pop festival. Again, this is what they left behind. It's not that difficult to bring tents home with you and use them again, clean them up. But this is what they left behind. So again, it's this huge issue in climate change and environmental issues, which is this gap between what people report and what they actually do, the value action gap. Now, the question I've been thinking about with colleagues over the last few years, is there really a value action gap? Is there really this enormous discrepancy between people's attitudes and what they do? And this is a really important issue because politicians always base their whole plans on people's reported attitude and what they say they want. Now, in order to assess this, I have to go back to the very beginning, to a guy called Gordon Allport, who was writing in the 1930s, who really is the kind of father of social psychology. And he came up with the concept of attitude and the concept of how we should measure attitudes. He said an attitude is a mental and neural state of readiness, organized through experience, exerting a directive or dynamic influence upon the individual's response to all objects and situations with which it's related. So it's a mental and neural state of readiness. And Allport introduced the very simple scales called the Likert scale to measure attitude. You give people just a scale 1 to 5, 1 to 7, and ask them how positive their attitude is to, say, low carbon items, and they say extremely positive. What do you think of high carbon items? Extremely negative, and so on. So you report, you have a mental and neural state of readiness, you report it, you measure it on a Likert scale. That's how people like Tesco and Unilever assessed that the public, the citizens were ready for change. So when you ask people to report it, and this is some research we've done on attitudes to carbon, 70% of participants reported a preference for low carbon products, 26% no preference, and 4%, only 4% of participants reported a preference for high carbon footprint items. So in other words, when you use this measure of attitudes, this is what you get on a Likert scale. Everyone says they want low carbon, and you can see why carbon labeling was introduced. But interestingly, if you go to Allport's original work, he also said this: often an attitude seemed to have no representation in consciousness, other than a vague sense of need or some indefinite or unanalyzable feeling of doubt, assent, conviction, effort, or familiarity. So he said, often you don't know what your attitude is. It's got no representation in consciousness. It might be this unconscious set of preferences which you can't access at all. And if you can't access them, if they're not available to consciousness, you can't simply report it on a scale. Now, this to me brings up a really interesting psychological issue about the whole issue of the readiness for a green revolution. Now, the problem is if attitudes can be unconscious, how do you measure them? Well, over the last few years, psychologists have been playing about with techniques for measuring attitudes that elude conscious introspection. And they've developed something called the implicit association test, which is a computerized classification task to measure associations in the brain. And it's been used probably the best known example is measuring unconscious attitudes to race or ethnicity. People report that they have no preferences whatsoever. When you use the IAT, you do find certain kinds of biases there, which seem to be predictive of behavior. So what we did was we developed the first carbon IAT, which was to measure unconscious attitudes to high and low carbon. And the basis for this test is very simple. You're looking at speed of association with evaluative concepts. So people don't report anything, they're just pressing buttons. But the odd thing about this button pressing is there seems to be a degree of consistency in it. And in some domains, it looks as if you can make behavior predictions from these button presses. And when you do the IAT on people, especially something like a carbon IAT, people are always a bit worried because they, to be honest, many people don't know how the results are going to, what's going to emerge. So it's very, very interesting. So it's based on a reaction time study. Now, when you do this in this domain of carbon, you find something which is quite extraordinary in a sense. So if you measure these implicit attitudes with this implicit association test and measure explicit attitudes on the normal scale, there is no significant correlation between the two things. So in other words, it doesn't matter what people say about how strongly they feel about low carbon or in the environment or sustainability. It doesn't seem to correlate with these implicit attitudes. And there are many what I call surface greens out there with a reported positive attitude to low carbon, but actually a positive implicit attitude to high carbon. So they say they care about the environment, but there is something going on below the surface. Now, in some sense, I don't think this should shock many people when you think about it, because when you think about it, think of all those decades of consumer advertising kind of telling us about, what it is to be someone in our society, Russian society, UK society, American society, any society, which is, it's about, big cars, big holidays, consumer goods, display, being someone because of what we own, what we buy, what we can afford. It's true a lot of the world over. So we've been reared on that stuff. Now, we all hear the arguments about sustainability, and presumably that's why we report what we do report. But surely all of that advertising's had some impact, and it seems to come out when you do this implicit association test. They seem to have this preference for these high carbon lifestyle products, which are at odds with what they say. Now, I would argue that if you want a green revolution, you need to understand these surface greens, because these are conflicted individuals. They may be very common, and interestingly, we don't know how common. I've done a little bit of pilot work in a number of different countries, China, India, Brazil, blah, 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 US. And the proportion seems to vary a little bit depending upon context, but understanding these people might be critical to the whole notion of generating a green revolution. Now, what do we know about these different types of attitudes and behavior? Well, sometimes explicit attitudes, sometimes we know ourselves in some domains, and when we think deeply about something and then make a choice, sometimes it affects behavior. But when it comes to spontaneous behaviors, things without much thought, the IAT, the implicit attitudes, are much better predictor. And if there's any kind of cognitive, emotional, or time pressure, if you're having to choose things, in a busy life, if you're under any kind of pressure, a lot of work stress or whatever, emotional stress, the IAT is a good predictor of what you do. And it's a much better predictor of behavior in sensitive domains. And I would argue two of those domains are racial discrimination and environmental testing. I did a book a few years ago called Our Racist Heart, showing that the IAT measures of implicit attitude to race predicted shortlisting decisions for jobs. What people reported had no predictive value whatsoever in that domain. And similarly, when it comes to environmental issues, there's too much social desirability with reporting you have attitudes of a particular kind. We've been doing a lot of research in our lab on this over the last few years, looking at choice, measuring people's implicit and explicit attitudes. And what we find is quite interesting. Implicit attitude to carbon footprint predicts choice of low carbon products, particularly under time pressure. What people report doesn't predict it. We give people an array of things to choose a product from. They're varying in value, energy, blah, 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 lots and lots of domains. One of those domains for differentiating the products is carbon footprint. It's only if you've got a positive implicit attitude to low carbon do you use that as a selection criteria. We've also done a lot of work on eye tracking. We show people different kinds of images of different scenes. Implicit attitude predicts how quickly you notice the climate change images. Reported attitude doesn't. And also, people with positive implicit attitudes to low carbon are more likely to focus on the carbon label. People with high positive explicit attitudes don't. So to me, this is really interesting, which is perhaps we need to rethink this whole notion of the value action gap. Think about where these implicit attitudes come from, because as I say, we've had decades of consumer advertising. Is it any wonder that people unconsciously, it may be suppressed, but have these really positive attitudes to high carbon lifestyles? And also rethink what big government and commercial campaigns are trying to do. Tesco thought it was just an informational issue. Tesco thought people have the right attitude, let's give them the carbon information, that's all we have to do. That's not all we have to do. If people's implicit attitudes to low carbon are not positive, we have to work on changing that implicit attitudes. And again, with Laura McGuire over the last few years, we've been seeing if we can change these implicit attitudes. And the good news is we've published our first paper on this. They can be changed, using certain kinds of emotional imaging and messaging. So we can work on that. And again, we're working on, in the northwest of England, we're working on an educational campaign to see whether we can change these implicit attitudes in school kids. So, but the important thing is, if we want a green revolution, we have to change these unconsciously held implicit attitudes. We can measure them. Now we need to change them. Now, so it's really interesting. So if we do want a green revolution, we need to mobilize the public. My view is that we need a new approach. And this new approach, for a while, it was a kind of word that psychologists didn't like to talk about, the unconscious, but it seems to be now back in vogue because we have a way of accessing it. Now, there's a really interesting little case study of this here, which was the unconscious was ignored by psychologists for a long time. But interestingly, it wasn't ignored by all psychologists. And I did a book a couple of years ago, 2018, called The Conflicted Mind. And in that book, I looked at the smoking industry and the use of someone who became a very well-known psychoanalyst called Ernest Dichter, who was brought in by the big advertising companies just after the war in the 40s and late 40s, 50s and 60s to work on marketing. And Dichter, being a psychoanalyst, wasn't afraid to look at unconscious motivations and not afraid to think about how we change unconscious orientations to something. He started off working on soap, but his main legacy, if you want to call it that, was smoking. And of course, when you think about behavior change, that's probably, I mean, it sounds an odd thing to say, but probably one of the most successful campaigns of all time when you think about how many people ended up addicted to cigarettes through marketing. And Dichter was really interesting because he said, look, let's not ask people what their attitude to smoking is. Let's not ask people what they report, why they smoke. Let's experiment and think about their unconscious reasons for smoking. And he wanted to identify the deeper psychological functions of smoking. He said smoking does a number of things. It's a self-reward. You could interrupt everyday life, have a cigarette. It's like being a child again, getting a reward kind of whenever you want it. So that's one aspect of the whole thing. He said, it gives you a sense of bonding with other smokers. You're never alone with a cigarette. There's the warm glow of the cigarette. A lot of smokers reported that. It made them feel comfortable, warm, real, connected. And a lot of early campaigns like Strand and Embassy had that as their basis. You're never alone with a Strand. And he said it's also an important way of relieving tension. It's a self-adapter. It's like self-adapters are self-comforting movements. And of course, smoking is you putting something in your mouth. It's oral gratification. It's like, touching your face to get a little bit of comfort. So it's oral gratification, and yet you can advertise it in a masculine way because you think children go in for oral gratification, but adults surely don't. But hey, with a cigarette, you can. And of course, what's really interesting is that he thought the whole way we think about advertising cigarettes needs to take these things into account. And it's very interesting the way he did it. So if you think about cigarettes are a way of relieving tension, should you advertise cigarettes in a way that in some sense increase tension and then in some sense present cigarettes to them as a way of dealing with that tension? And it's been pointed out that some very well-known campaigns for cigarettes used exactly that approach. So this is an advert for Marlboro Lights. And at first level, it just looks like the traditional Marlboro man, the Western, the US Western guy rounding the horses up, the masculine ideal, guy, but nevertheless a macho man who's prepared to smoke low-tar cigarettes. And people pointed out, well, there might be a little bit more to this image than at first sight might appear, because the unconscious can process information that's there that we might not consciously see, but nevertheless is going to have an influence on us at a subconscious level. And it's been pointed out there's a couple of really odd features of this image. So, for example, the thing behind the main horse that looks like another horse, when you see it close up, it's actually a wolf. It's a wolf that at first glance looks like a horse, but isn't a horse. And it's also been pointed out that in the clouds at the back, there are some things there which look remarkably like skulls. Now, Dichter's argument, being a psychoanalyst, was, look, our minds are picking this information up. They might not do it consciously, but they're picking it up. And why might that be important? Well, because wolves are a pack animal. They run in packs. This is a lone wolf, isolated on its own. So it's kind of giving that concept of loneliness to individuals subconsciously. And why are there skulls in the sky? Well, because it's reminding of their own mortality. It's making people anxious and nervous on a subconscious level, and then saying, look, here's a socially acceptable way of dealing with it. Let have a cigarette, be macho like the Marlboro man. So it's kind of working on the subconscious and at the same time offering a resolution. And what's really interesting about Dichter's whole approach, now don't forget, the smoking campaigns he ran were incredibly successful. So none of this would make sense if they weren't so successful. But he said, look, He wasn't afraid to discuss unconscious motivations. He wasn't afraid to disregard people's self-reports or their personal accounts or narratives as explanations of their own behavior. He says, look, we all have to be rational agents. We have to give people explanations. But he said, you don't really have to pay any attention to that. And it's really interesting that maybe when it comes to climate change, we need to learn something about this. There's no point in just dealing with stuff on the surface, dealing with people's self-reports all the time, just what they say that they care. Maybe we have to think about this notion of our own conscious attitudes to high carbon lifestyles and think, how are we going to deal with this? Now, there's something else really interesting about the whole smoking thing. Next slide, please. Because in some sense, you know, we knew about the harmful effects of cigarettes for a very long time. The research in the very early 1950s, it was absolutely clear there was a connection between lung cancer and smoking. How did the tobacco companies try to deal with it? Well, they tried to set up a debate about the effects of smoking on health. And in 1953, the big companies came together to fund research for something called the Council for Tobacco Research. And what they wanted to do was to set up a counter argument to say, look, there may be a correlation between smoking and lung cancer, but that doesn't prove causality. And Dichter himself said, look, the reason there's a connection is people make smokers feel guilty. And it's that guilt which is giving them cancer. It's not the cigarettes, it's the guilt. But Dichter was clearly part of the industry, so that wasn't so strong. But incredibly, what they then did was they got some people who weren't part of the industry, a guy called Hans Selye, who was often called the father of stress. He came along and said, it's stress that kills, not smoking. He says, look, certain people are prone to stress and they develop cancer, and those people who suffer from stress tend to smoke. And again, it's a spurious correlation between the cigarettes and the cancer. And he was paid secretly hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars at the time, a lot of money in today's money, to expand those views. In the UK, there was a very famous psychologist called Hans Eysenck, famous psychologist, and he said, look, certain personalities are prone to develop cancer, and those same personalities are prone to smoke. And again, there's a spurious correlation. So, and again, we didn't know about the amount of money through secret accounts these people were being paid to set up this debate about the harmful effects of smoking. And of course, there is an argument that something very similar has happened in climate change, which is the great debate about the science, about unpicking the science, only happened in 1997, 1998, after Kyoto, when the implications of the climate change research for the big energy companies became clear. Suddenly there was a great debate. And of course, for years, the media has used the notion of balance about climate change, anti-climate change, just as for a while, there was a great debate about smoking. I mean, and of course, with smoking, things became clearer and clearer, as I think the argument is it's also true of climate change. The science in the end wins out. So how do we encourage a green revolution? Well, we need to explain the science better and clear up conceptual confusions. We need to explain to people that a change in the weather for slightly colder isn't an argument against climate change. And we have to explain to people that high rainfall is actually associated with climate change, and that climate change is about more extreme weather and not just as more gentle warming year on year, minute by minute, day by day. I think there's an important thing about messaging. Climate change messages must be designed to overcome optimism bias. We cannot just scare people. Greta saying this house is on fire is just going to panic people. I think in order to get people to even focus on the message, there has to be positive bits in there. And you have to think about what people see in messages, what they fixate on. We can't just scare them. We need to increase people's feeling of self-efficacy and response efficacy when it comes to their actions. Self-efficacy means that you can make a difference. Response efficacy is that what you can do could make a difference to the individual thing. And I think without self-efficacy and response efficacy, fear messages and climate message, and the notion of existential threat is, if nothing else, a fear message, people find other defense mechanisms for dealing with it. So if you want people on board, you have to persuade them that they can make a difference and their actions can be important. We need to recognize that self-reported attitudes to carbon might lull us into a false sense of security. I think that has happened. I mean, as I say, I've been working on this in some detail since 2010. I think in 2010, or sorry, before 2010, but in 2010, I think people were persuaded by all these self-report measures that it's going to be an easy informational issue. I don't think that's correct. I think we need to think a bit deeper about people's attitudes and the implications of that. And as I say, if people's implicit attitudes to carbon are not positive, we need to think about a type of advertising. We've done it with lifestyles. Why can't we do it with greener lifestyles to get people to change their underlying emotional attitude towards low carbon products and lifestyles? And we need to understand that many people have implicit and explicit attitudes to carbon that are dissociated. I think that's really important because I think there is a degree of conflict in people. And that conflict may be unconsciously held. They may report their attitudes, but they may be surprised that their actions don't correspond. I think when we understand the concept of implicit attitudes, we may understand that better. We need to find new ways of identifying these individuals. As I say, we've not got online IATs, so we could start doing market segment analysis to look at it in different countries, how the proportions vary, and therefore what future campaigns should look like. And I think we need different strategies for different groups and countries. The barriers will be different. If people's implicit attitudes and explicit attitudes to low carbon are both positive, then it may well be an informational issue. If their implicit attitudes are not positive, we need to work on changing those implicit attitudes. As I say, our research is what do these individuals see, what do they attend to, because that's going to vary depending upon what these underlying attitudes are like. And the really, really big thing is we need to work on changing our implicit attitude to carbon products and lifestyles by influencing our underlying associated networks. To me, that is the big challenge ahead. How do we avert a climate catastrophe? This is what we need to do. We can't just assume that everyone gets the message, everyone gets the point, they're primed and ready to go. I don't believe they are. So I think we need much more interesting thinking about how we change people's deep-seated values, and how because those deep-seated values from all our research seem to have an implication on what they do subsequently. And why do I have a slight optimism bias here? Why do I think that will work? Well, all my research into the smoking industry showed that such a change is possible with significant behavioral implications. Dichter changed the way smoking was advertised by having a depth psychology approach, and it transformed the success of smoking marketing. And I think we need something similar with climate change. Oh, there isn't the last slide. There is the last slide. And this is, if anyone's interested in this topic, I wrote a book with Laura McGuire called The Psychology of Climate Change, which contains some of these arguments. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for such an insightful lecture. We have about 10 minutes now for a Q&A session, and I'll try to limit myself for just one question, and then we will turn to the members of our audience. So Jeff, there was an article in the New York Times just yesterday about the gender gap in politics. Basically, it said that white men are the most conservative part of the population. In your opinion, is there such a gender gap in the perception of climate change?
It's a very interesting question, actually. In terms of underlying implicit attitudes, I don't think that emerges so clearly. I think that in terms of, again, it's women of different ages, of course, and you could argue that the whole issue about thinking about the future, women have got more explicit reported concerns about the future if they have families, of course. And I'm not sure that we know enough about how those concerns then feed into the development of implicit attitudes. But it is an interesting point. I think gender interacts with so many other variables, though, which is, education, class, media consumption is a big one, because again, in terms of the research I know, there is a little bit of difference in terms of which, for example, certainly in the UK, which newspapers men and women read. There is a bit of a gender imbalance in that. And I think that there are certain newspapers which are primarily read by women, which are very conservative about climate change, actually. Differences in men and women in how they explicitly think about climate change when it comes to climate, when it comes to implicit attitudes, it's probably less clear at the moment, although it may change in the future. And I think that the one major issue that I would think would be important here would be the patterns of media consumption by men and women, because certainly in terms of the places I know about, there is a bit of an imbalance there, which probably would have implications for how they think.
Great, thank you. And the first question from our viewers. What does the term climate catastrophe actually mean? Hasn't it already happened, since we see so many natural disasters out there?
It's a good question, and I think there are a whole series of climate catastrophes already, because clearly things have started to change, and they've been changing over the last number of years. Changing in terms of extreme weather, in terms of flooding, in terms of tsunamis, in terms of heat, very significant rises in temperatures in particular parts of the globe. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, because, and I suppose the semantics of how to avert a climate catastrophe, it should have been a slightly longer title, which is how to avert future climate catastrophes, or how to limit climate catastrophes. I mean, but I suppose what I'm concerned about is that there is so much still to be done, and so much still to be done at the level of societies in whatever country by individuals in terms of the influences they can make. And I suppose it's trying to think about how they can make changes and how they can put pressure on their political leaders in terms of things getting much worse. And it's an interesting question in a sense, because again, there's a kind of cognitive bias inherent in that, which is, I think sometimes when we think things are already too bad, there's nothing we can do. And I think and this is really interesting about optimism. So we need a level of optimism to think we can still make a difference, but we can't have that optimism bias to think we can still make a difference, and anyway, it's not going to affect me anyway. It's almost as if we need to encourage one of those propositions, but not the other, in order to kind of live in a habitable world, really.
Speaking of what can we do, what actions can we take right now in order to lower our impact on the environment?
Well, the changes in broad, lowering the carbon footprint of our lifestyle. So it's transport, it's energy use, it's choosing low carbon alternatives, it's going meat free some of the time. I mean, there's lots of choices people can make, and what's interesting these days, of course, is that there are carbon calculators. You can work out what things that you can do to change, because it's been argued that such a big part of our overall carbon footprint is down to those individual choices. And that's one type of thing. But I think other types of things are in some sense, making clear to our political leaders that we are ready for major changes. And that, in some sense, because everything's going to come at a cost, and I think that's the issue. And I've seen British politicians kind of stuck in that dilemma, which is what will the public support in terms of changes to their lifestyle and their standard of living, and what wouldn't they support? But you can see that a lot of governments are starting to move towards greener forms of energy. And I think that the message that individuals need to send really is that this is what we want, this is what we demand. So it's this business of, in some sense, the real issue is how you link up individual behavior with community and national efforts with political efforts. I mean, there has to be alignment between all three. But I suppose the point of my little talk is to say that what's incredible over the last decade or so is that even when politicians were trying to lead on this, and even when commercial companies were trying to lead on this, it was the consumers and our attitudes that was the obstacle. And I think that in some sense, it's we need to address that issue, and we need to address the issue that it's not just what we say that's important. And to go back to the man on the bus in Sheffield, this notion that you don't talk about it anymore, I think we need more ways of identifying what some of these psychological barriers are. Because I think there are psychological barriers which are preventing people from doing what they need to do. And part of that psychological barrier is that I think no matter what they do, it won't make a difference. And I think that's the politics of doom really here. I think we all have to do what we can really to change.
In one of the previous lectures of this festival, we've discussed that a large amount of the media articles about climate change are published in the myth-busting format. Don't you think it has a negative effect in the public's perception?
Interesting question again. It's a complicated one, really, because the myth-busting thing, what it's doing is saying, look, here is what some people believe, and this is the counter-argument, here's the evidence. So I suppose it's trying to lay the thing out in a reasonably clear way. I think the biggest problem about negative perception, I mean, to me, it's a really interesting issue. And I suppose until I started researching it, I didn't realize it was so significant, which is we think that when anyone who ever writes an article, you assume that when you write an article, everyone will, and if they choose to read it, everyone will get roughly the same information from that article. And I suppose this work on eye tracking we've been doing persuades me that two human beings can read the same article and see something completely different, and see it not just in the metaphorical sense, which is, oh, I saw this, you saw that, but in the actual physical sense, what they fixate on does vary. And to me, that is a really interesting issue, which is how do we design climate change messages so that the critical stuff is going to be perceived by all. And what I've been trying to do is play about with this notion of how we can build rays of hope into those articles, throughout the articles, so that any patterns of fixation will allow people to extract a positive message, but at the same time making them aware of the seriousness of the threat. So to get back to the question about myth busting, I suppose, I can see that it may put some people off because they're saying, oh, okay, because you're stereotyping me by saying I subscribe to these myths. I'm like, not a wise person, and you're trying to say, oh, it's so straightforward. And look, I am a citizen scientist like everyone else. I can make my own mind up. Just show me the arguments for and against, and I will balance them up and I will resolve them in my own head. And I've got an intelligence and a brain. Just leave it to me. But some of the eye tracking stuff says that people just don't work like that. What they do is they see the bits they want to see. So to me, it's a really good question, because the whole issue of how best to get that information across, so that in some sense we get people primed for action and not just for discussion or defense mechanisms or anything else. To me, it's one of the critical issues that hasn't really been addressed. People just think it's all to do with the volume of stuff you get out there or get the message out. But it's not getting the message out that's important. It's what people do, having read the message, it's critical. We need much more analysis of that.
Sure, absolutely. Moving on to less complicated questions. What 3 books everyone should read? And you can name your own books.
What should everyone read? Let me think. Let me think what I would recommend. Let me find a few. There's a book by Marshall called "Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change." It's a good one. Marshall was 2015. Hoffman, How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate. Very good. A book I love, which is Oreskes and Conway, Merchants of Doubt. If you want to see the smoking stuff in climate change, this notion of how you generate doubt and uncertainty is a very, very good book. And of course, Psychology of Climate Change. Let me put it at the end. We've summarized some of the psychological aspects in that book, so I think it's okay.
Great. Could you please walk us through your personal story? How did you become interested in the psychology of climate change?
Again, it's an interesting issue. I've been interested in implicit communication and implicit cognition for some time, because I've always believed that not everything's on the surface. It's not what people say. So I worked on communication for quite a few years. But I think in about 2007, I suddenly thought, hang on, there is this problem, enormous problem, that needs a little bit of attention. It needs a slightly different type of approach. And I think the way I'd been thinking about stuff geared me to thinking in a slightly different way about it. So I got a chance to work through something called the Sustainable Consumption Institute, which had kind of connections with some of the big commercial companies that were trying stuff, including Tesco. And so I was there when Tesco were doing the carbon labeling, but incredibly, they hadn't thought about this business of eye tracking. And I think they weren't very pleased when I did the research showing that there was very little visual attention to the carbon labels, which you think is something that should be checked. So I was interested in bringing my kind of behavioral analysis, because I've done a lot on, connected to implicit cognition and communication, to bear on this topic. And it just seems to me that it gave me kind of insights into some of the problems. As I say, I've also worked on racial discrimination as well. I did a book called Our Racist Heart on that. And the same kinds of thinking really informed that, which is in universities in the UK, there's an incredible racial imbalance. And the question is why? Universities were wringing their hands about it, but it seems to be connected with implicit attitudes again, which we can measure and predict. So I suppose it was that, which was, I'd got an academic background in a certain way of thinking about human beings. I saw a problem that needed a different way of thinking, so I brought the two things together, really. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's time for my last question. When it comes to climate change, are you a pessimist or an optimist?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I try to be an optimist, because I think that if you are, we know that optimists tend to get things done. So if I was a pessimist, I don't think I would be trying anything. But on the other hand, I'm very aware of the nature of the problem and the incredible size of the gap between what people are saying and doing. So that's why I'm trying desperately to get the message out there, which is, look, we need different ways of thinking about this. We need all to do something. And I like the notion that all revolutions start with individuals, really, and come from the bottom up. The 2010 revolution was top down and didn't involve people. But I think it's about all of us kind of examining what we do and why we do it, really, and being kind of led that way, really, and kind of recognizing, in some sense, something about these underlying attitudes, and all of those years of advertising have geared us to thinking in certain kinds of ways. And I just think that needs to change. We need to think differently.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. I think we covered lots of very important topics today, and it was my pleasure to speak to you.
It was a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope your audience got something out of it.
I would like to thank the UK Embassy in Moscow and Theory and Practice portal for hosting us today. And thank you for our translator and the whole technical team. And thank you for participating in this discussion.